My sister got married on a night when the rain never stopped, and she made sure I was standing outside in it, soaked to the bone. She called it a lesson, as if leaving me shivering in the cold was the only way to remind me of where she thought I belonged. I pressed my hands against the glass doors, watching her twirl in her gown while our family clapped and laughed, the warmth inside blinding compared to the storm that wrapped around me. For years, I had been the one to carry her burdens, to pay the bills she could not, to shield her from the worst of our stepfather's cruelty, and yet I was the one she cast out like an uninvited stranger. Every drop of rain felt heavier than the last, pressing me down with the weight of every betrayal. I thought humiliation had reached its peak, until headlights cut across the driveway. A sleek black car pulled up through the storm, slowing in front of me. The back door opened, and I knew in that instant that whatever happened next would change everything. The rain had been coming down in cold sheets all afternoon, and by the time I stepped out of the cab at the entrance of the lakeshore resort, it felt like the sky itself had turned against me. My coat was soaked through before I even made it up the stone path, and my shoes squished with every step. The glow of the ballroom lights poured from the tall windows, golden and warm, while I stood shivering under the gray Michigan sky. I pulled my invitation from my bag, already smudged and soft from the damp, and walked toward the entrance. The man at the door barely glanced at it before crossing his arms. He looked nervous, almost apologetic, but he still blocked the way. "Greta Thompson, right?" he muttered, then cleared his throat. "Miss Lydia told me you were not supposed to come in." His words hit harder than the rain, and for a moment I thought I had misheard him. I tried to steady my voice. "That's my sister's wedding. I'm her maid of honor." He shook his head, eyes sliding away from mine. "Orders are orders, ma'am. She said you needed to stay outside until you learned your place." The phrase sliced straight through me. Learn my place. My teeth were chattering, and not just from the cold. I turned my head toward the tall glass doors. Inside, I saw my sister twirling across the polished floor, her white gown sparkling under the chandeliers. Our mother stood near the cake, laughing with Martin, her second husband. They looked so comfortable, so certain I did not belong. I pressed my palm to the glass, leaving a wet mark, half hoping my sister might glance my way, half dreading that she would. For a second, our eyes met across the room. Her smile never faltered, but I saw the way her chin lifted, the way she leaned closer to Martin, as if to say, "Look, she is right where we wanted her." My stomach twisted, and I stepped back into the rain. The guard shifted awkwardly, but he did not move. I could smell the wet asphalt, feel the icy drops running down my spine, and hear the muffled cheer of guests singing along with the band. I thought of all the years I had held my sister's hand through exams, paid her tuition when Martin refused, covered the mortgage when Mom's hours at the diner were cut. 10 years of sacrifice all brushed aside with a single cruel sentence. A group of guests hurried past me toward the door, umbrellas snapping in the wind. One woman looked at me with pity, then whispered something to her husband. They both laughed softly as they disappeared inside. My cheeks burned hotter than the rain was cold. I wrapped my arms around myself, trembling harder. It felt like the cold was sinking into my bones, spreading until even my thoughts were heavy. I wanted to leave, to find a cab to vanish from this nightmare, but my legs refused to move. Part of me was rooted there, unable to walk away from the family that had so easily walked away from me. Headlights cut through the rain, startling me. A black sedan slowed at the curb, tires hissing against the wet pavement. My first thought was another set of late guests, ready to brush past me like the others. But the back door opened and out stepped Eleanor Price, my cousin. Her dark hair was pulled back, rain dripping from the edge of her coat, but her eyes were fixed on me with an intensity I had not seen in years. She hurried toward me, an umbrella snapping open above our heads. "Greta," she whispered, her voice urgent, "this night is not just Lydia's big day." The words sent a chill deeper than the rain ever could. I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, but she pressed a hand to my arm, her expression a mixture of sympathy and determination. The ballroom behind us erupted in laughter, the music swelling, and I realized my humiliation was only the beginning. I stood there shivering beneath Eleanor's umbrella, heart pounding, as the weight of her words settled into me. Something was coming, and whatever it was, it would not leave this family untouched. The rain kept falling. The rain followed me home that night, or maybe it just stayed inside me, cold and unshakable. I peeled off my soaked coat in the hallway of my small apartment in Ann Arbor and hung it over a chair, watching water drip to the floor. My shoes squelched as I walked to the kitchen, and I wanted nothing more than to collapse. But my cousin Eleanor's envelope was still in my hand, heavier now than it had felt outside the resort. I placed it on the counter, staring at the seal as if opening it would split my life into 2 parts. Before and after. I made tea. Though my hands were trembling so badly, I spilled half the hot water on the counter. The steam rose, fogging my glasses, and still I did not move to touch the envelope. Finally, I sat at the table and slid a finger beneath the flap. The papers inside smelled faintly of old wood and ink. Legal papers, deeds, signatures, names that I knew all too well. Martin Price, Lydia Thompson. And at the bottom of one page, my own name scrawled across a section I had no memory of signing. My breath caught as I scanned line after line. Eleanor had not exaggerated. This was about the house my father had left us, the property on Huron Street. He had died when I was 24, leaving the house to both of us, Lydia and me equally, but the papers in front of me told another story. They claimed Lydia had full rights, that I had signed mine away for a sum of money I had never received. My hands tightened on the paper until it crumpled. When Eleanor had pressed the envelope into my hand, her eyes had carried more than pity. They had carried a warning. I understand now. Martin, my stepfather, had orchestrated this with Lydia. And Mom must have known. That explained the distance, the avoidance, the way she had looked through me that night at the wedding as if I were already erased. I barely noticed when Eleanor's text came through. "I'm outside. We need to talk." I went to the window, pulling the curtain back. Her car was parked at the curb, headlights still on. I opened the door before she could knock. She stepped in quickly, shaking the rain from her umbrella, her hair damp around her face. "You opened it," she said quietly, glancing at the papers on the table. I nodded, unable to form words. She sat down, her face pale but steady. "I couldn't let you keep living blind," she said. "I found those when I was helping Dad clean out some files. They were buried deep, Greta. They wanted you to never see them." "Why?" My voice cracked. "Why would they do this to me?" Eleanor sighed. "Martin never thought of you as his. He wanted Lydia to have everything. And Lydia, she went along because it was easier and profitable." I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to steady the room that felt like it was spinning. "I never signed these, I will remember." Eleanor reached across the table, touching my arm. "That's because you didn't. It's forged. I compared the signature to your driver's license application from that same year. They don't match. I'm not a lawyer, but this looks bad for them." I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. My chest ached. For years, I had thought my family's indifference was personal, emotional, but it was calculated. They had erased me from my own father's legacy and left me in the rain, laughing inside while I froze. The tea had gone cold on the table. I took a sip anyway, the bitterness grounding me. "What do I do now?" "That depends," Eleanor said carefully. "Do you want to fight, or do you want to walk away?" The question lingered like smoke. I had always been the quiet one, the one who patched things up, who paid the bills, who kept the peace. But standing outside that wedding, soaked and humiliated, something inside me had shifted. "I can't walk away," I whispered. Eleanor gave a small nod as if she had expected nothing else. "Then you need a lawyer. And you need to be prepared. This won't just be about property. Once you start, everything will come out." I thought of Lydia's glittering smile, Mom's cold indifference, Martin's smug arm wrapped around both of them. My humiliation at the resort had been public, but this could strip their perfect facade bare. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the world still felt gray. I hardly slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the echo of the guard's words. "Learn your place." At work, I could barely focus. My desk at the university library looked the same. Stacks of books waiting to be cataloged, the hum of computers, students passing through with backpacks slung over their shoulders. But everything felt fragile, unreal. When my coworker Mark asked if I was all right, I forced a smile and said I was just tired. He gave me a skeptical look but didn't push. By lunchtime, Eleanor texted again. "I set up a meeting, tomorrow, 10 o'clock. Downtown, be there." That night, I sat by the window with the papers spread across the table again. Every line seemed to tighten around me like a rope. I tried to picture my father's face, the way he had smiled when he took me fishing, how he had whispered once that he wanted both his girls to be safe, always safe. He would never have wanted this. The anger rose again, stronger this time. Anger at Lydia for smiling while I stood outside in the rain. Anger at Martin for thinking he could manipulate me forever. Anger at Mom for staying silent. I fell asleep at the table, the papers scattered under my head. The next morning, Eleanor picked me up. The drive downtown felt endless, the gray buildings looming as we pulled up to a law office with brass letters on the door. Inside, the air smelled of leather and paper. We sat across from a man in a dark suit, his glasses perched low on his nose, as he read through the documents Eleanor had found. When he finally looked up, his expression was sharp. "This is serious fraud. If you're ready, we can move forward. But understand it will be messy. Family cases always are." I glanced at Eleanor. She gave a small nod, steady as ever. "I'm ready," I said, surprising myself with how firm my voice sounded. The lawyer leaned back, folding his hands. Then we'll begin. I'll need more records, bank statements, old letters, anything that shows your relationship to the property. And be prepared for resistance. They will not take this lightly. Resistance. I almost laughed. I had faced resistance my whole life from them. This time I was not planning to bend. As we left the office, the wind picked up again, tugging at my coat. I pulled it tighter around me, but for the first time in years, the cold did not feel like defeat. It felt like fuel. Eleanor slipped her arm through mine as we walked back to the car. "Whatever comes," she said quietly, "you won't face it alone." I nodded, my throat tight. For the first time in a long time, I believed her. The week before Lydia's wedding was a blur of phone calls, arguments, and demands that felt like a storm gathering on the horizon. I had been teaching late grading essays in my classroom at Westfield High when my phone buzzed with a call from Martin. His voice was clipped sharp, like he was already angry before I even answered. He told me the wedding was costing $75,000 and that I was expected to contribute. The way he said it, not asked but expected, made my chest tighten. I tried to keep my voice calm. "Martin, I can't do that. I'm still paying off of my student loans. I have my own bills." There was silence for a moment, then his laugh, low and bitter. "You're a teacher, Greta. You've been pulling in a steady paycheck for years. Your sister deserves this day, and you need to step up." I pressed my forehead against the chalkboard in my classroom, the phone hot against my ear. I thought about the 10 years of checks I had written, the countless times I had swiped my card for their emergencies. I thought of the nights I skipped dinners with friends because I was too tired from covering another family crisis. Something in me snapped. I said no, my voice was firmer than I felt. The silence on the other end chilled me more than his laugh. Then he muttered, selfish, just like always, before hanging up. The next day, Mom called. Her voice was weary but sharp, the way it always got when she wanted me to fall in line. "Greta, your sister is under so much stress. She's trying to make this wedding perfect. Can't you just help this one last time?" I closed my eyes, picturing her in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, leaning against the counter with her arms folded, disappointment written across her face. "Mom, I can't. I've already done more than my share." My words trembled, not from doubt, but from the weight of knowing they would never believe me. When I showed up at the rehearsal dinner a few nights later, the air was thick with tension. The restaurant was bright and loud, filled with Lydia's friends, James's family, and the smell of garlic bread and wine. Lydia was glowing in a pale blue dress surrounded by bridesmaids. Martin sat at the head of the table, his arm draped possessively over the back of Mom's chair. When I approached, conversation dipped for a moment, then picked up again with forced cheer. Lydia turned to me, her smile tight, her voice carrying just enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Greta, you're not contributing to the wedding fund, are you?" It wasn't a question, it was an accusation wrapped in silk. I froze, heat rushing to my face. "No," I said quietly, "I can't." The room seemed to lean toward us. Lydia's smile widened, but her eyes were cold. "Well, then maybe you shouldn't expect to be front and center on Saturday. After all, this is my day, not yours." The bridesmaids giggled, their laughter bubbling like champagne. Mom looked down at her plate. Martin smirked, swirling his wine. I wanted the floor to open and swallow me whole. Later that night, back at my apartment, I sat on the edge of my bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to drown out the echo of their laughter. That was when I stumbled on the email. Lydia had left her laptop open at the dinner, and while she went to greet a guest, I had absent-mindedly glanced at the screen. The subject line burned into my memory plans for Saturday. The message was from Martin, and the words were seared into my mind. "Keep Greta outside until she learns her place. Make sure the staff knows." I stared at the email, my stomach twisting. It was not just cruelty. It was deliberate, planned, coordinated. They had decided together to humiliate me on the biggest day of Lydia's life, to parade my absence as part of the celebration. I should have taken a screenshot, but in my shock, I froze. By the time I thought to act, Lydia was back, closing the laptop with a quick motion and slipping it into her bag. She looked at me, then her eyes glinting as if she knew I had seen enough. I barely slept that night, tossing under the thin quilt, my mind racing. My chest ached with a mix of fear and rage. I had endured their words, their demands, their endless hunger for more. But this was different. This was a public execution of my dignity wrapped up in lace and roses. All week, I carried the secret knowledge of that email like a stone in my pocket, heavy and impossible to forget. Every time I passed a shop window filled with bridal gowns, every time I overheard my students whispering about prom, I thought of Lydia's smirk, Martin's order, Mom's silence. By Friday, I felt like a clock winding tighter and tighter, each tick a reminder that Saturday was coming, and with it a storm I could no longer avoid. The night before the wedding, I sat alone in my kitchen, a cup of cold coffee in my hands, staring at the rain streaking down the window. I thought about calling Eleanor, but we had grown distant over the years, our contact limited to holiday cards and the occasional Facebook message. I did not know then that she was already on her way, carrying truths I had been denied. All I knew was that the trap had been set, and I was walking straight into it. Rain ticked along the rim of Eleanor's umbrella, while the ballroom behind us throbbed with music that made the doors breathe. Lot lamps cast halos in the puddles, and the lake beyond looked like slate pulled tight. My fingers were so numb I did not feel the manila envelope until Eleanor pressed it into my hands, and its dryness shocked me back into my body. I eased the flap and slid out a stack of copies that smelled like a courthouse file room. The heading sat with a gravity that steadied and unsteadied me. Last Will and Testament of Charles Thompson. The date pinned me to late spring of 2015. I saw lilacs against the porch rail on Walnut Street. My father teaching me to change a furnace filter, the way he said safe like it was a promise you could hold. My name appeared on the next page, and my pulse found a stubborn pace. Read slowly, Eleanor said, and breathe between lines. I let the sentences separate and rejoin until the meaning landed. The house on Walnut Street was left to me. Not to Martin, not to Lydia, to me. Heat rose into my face, a flush of shock and recognition. For years, I had been the outsider in my own family story. Here was my father writing me back inside with careful ink. I asked how she found it. She told me about a misfile at the county building, a clerk who remembered signatures, a drawer that opened if you lifted and pulled. She made copies and waited because she did not know who to trust. She waited because a truth that arrives at the wrong moment can do harm. The rain stitched a silver seam along the umbrella, and I kept reading. My name appeared again in a signature that looked like mine if you had watched me sign from across a room and copied it from memory. The loop in the G was pinched. The slant was wrong. The page claimed I had sold my share for a payment I never saw. The backs of my knees went cold. Eleanor's hand settled on my sleeve. "We will have it compared," she said. "Forensic people do this every day. Give me Monday." I folded the pages and tucked them under my coat so the corners pressed my ribs. In the window, Lydia floated in her gown with a brightness that used to make me proud and now made my teeth ache. James smiled without letting it reach his eyes. Martin stood behind my mother with a hand on the small of her back. I could not stop reading the room. Years of practice will do that even when you want to look away. I told Eleanor about the email on Lydia's laptop. Plans for Saturday. Keep Greta outside until she learns her place. Saying it out loud sharpened the air. Paper theft. Public humiliation. 2 routes to the same destination. Eleanor watched my face the way doctors watch scans. "What do you want to do?" she asked. I saw myself step through the door and slap the copies on the table. I saw Lydia lift her chin. Martin laugh, my mother drop her eyes. The scene tasted stale, like air in a closet no one opens. I made myself picture another scene. A clerk stamping certified across clean copies. A judge reading dates and seals in a quiet room where no band could drown a sentence. I heard my own voice choose. We wait. Relief crossed Eleanor's face. She laid out steps with the steadiness of someone who has crossed this kind of river. In the morning, we file. We ask for a hold that freezes any transfer. We loop in counsel who does not scare when someone raises a voice. We gather the small proofs that add into a weight no one can lift. Slow power. The phrase felt right in my mouth. The guard at the door glanced over as if the envelope had a glow. He looked away quickly. Cruelty is easier to enforce when you pretend not to understand it. I asked Eleanor to step away from the windows. We walked to the hydrangeas where drops slid from each bloom like coins. The lake breathed. My shoulders finally dropped from my ears. I told her about Walnut Street as if I were introducing a friend. The creak of the first step, the warm pocket on the landing in January, the pencil marks on the pantry door where my father measured us. I said I wanted to sand the paint until those marks returned and frame them under glass. I wanted a table big enough for lesson plans and coffee mugs. I wanted to hear the house tick as it cooled at night and know the sound belonged to me. Inside, the maid of honor praised loyalty. I thought of my father sanding a birdhouse and handing me extra sandpaper for the edges. He never said loyalty. He said it was safe. I understand the difference now. Loyalty without honesty is a leash. Safe is a porch light left on because you trust the person you love will come home. Eleanor checked the time and said the band would take a break soon and the room would echo. That echo is when a truth lands hardest. I pictured the space between songs and felt my breath even. She asked if I was scared. I said yes, and that the fear felt clean. The old fear begged me to apologize. This fear made me stand up straight. We warmed our hands in her car. Wintergreen and old coffee hung in the air, and the heater glazed the windshield before she cracked the window. She asked if I had any notes from my father. I told her about a message he had tucked into my backpack my first semester of college. Work hard and rest hard and keep your keys where you can reach them. I smiled without meaning to. Eleanor smiled too and said he had known how to take care of the future while he was still in the present. Back under the portico, the doors opened and a wash of buttercream and wine rolled out. I saw my mother at the edge of the dance floor with her hand at her throat, touching the pearls my father had bought her the year before he died. I felt the tug to go to her and say I am here. Then Martin moved between us and bent his head to her ear. She nodded without looking toward the door. The tug cooled into resolve. The guard asked if everything was all right. I told him we would not be a problem. He said the rain had drifted east. I thanked him and felt a flicker of compassion for a man paid to keep a list of who belongs and who does not. He glanced once more at the envelope and then looked away, as if refusing to witness could keep him safe. A sedan hissed to a stop and a woman hurried inside. As the door swung back, I heard the end of a joke fold into applause. Lydia's laugh rose sharp. James stood with his shoulders tight. The man in the dark suit hovered at the bar like a shadow asking for a name tag. Lydia looked invincible. I knew better. A structure can look perfect right up to the minute a hidden crack meets a change in weather. Eleanor touched my arm. We have done enough for this hour, she said. Tomorrow we trade the clatter of a band for the tick of a courthouse clock. I nodded because the decision had set the moment I felt my father's name under my fingertips. I tucked the envelope deeper into my coat until I could feel its weight like a key against my heart. We walked to the edge of the pavement and watched a gull settle on a light pole and then lift again as if trialing a choice. For years, my choices had been to pay or not pay, and either way to apologize. Tonight, I had chosen a third way. Wait, hold the line. Let truth step onto the dance floor on its own feet. Wind came off the lake and found the damp corners under my collar. I did not flinch. I looked at the ballroom one last time. Chandeliers shimmered, people clapped. Somewhere a glass rang like a bell. The ground under me felt steadier than an hour before, as if some careful hand had leveled the horizon by a degree only I could feel. Eleanor said the start of something is rarely loud. It is a weight in your pocket you cannot forget is there. I patted the envelope and felt paper and ink and my father's quiet decisions. The night could keep its music. I had what they tried to bury and I had time. We did not speak for a while. The clouds thinned to a chalk line of moon, and the lake made a steady sound, like a breath finding its rhythm after a hard day. Then the band inside stopped and the room exhaled. I did not move. I stood under the dripping umbrella beside Eleanor, my dress clinging cold against my skin. The music inside the ballroom rose and fell, the steady rhythm of celebration that had no space for me. When the double doors opened again, the blast of warmth and perfume made me flinch. A group of neighbors from our church filed past, their heels clicking on the wet pavement, one of them Mrs. Lawson squinted at me through the rain. Greta, you are not inside. Her tone was light but sharp, the kind of curiosity that stung worse than judgment. Another woman leaned in and whispered loud enough for me to hear. Maybe she is jealous. Sisters can be like that. They chuckled, adjusting their coats before disappearing into the glow. My throat tightened, and I forced myself to look down at my shoes rather than their pitying stares. The rain plastered my hair against my cheeks. I tried to breathe slowly, but every sound from the ballroom felt like a knife. Glasses clinking, music shifting into another song, laughter so bright it echoed off the walls. Each note reminded me that my family was inside smiling, pretending I never existed. Through the tall windows I caught sight of Lydia twirling with James. Her white gown shimmered as she laughed, head tilted back like the world belonged to her. For a heartbeat, her gaze swept toward the door where I stood, and for a second I thought she might break away. Instead, she leaned in closer to James, whispering something that made him smile as his hand tightened on her waist. She was performing for me, making sure I saw how little my absence mattered. I pressed my palms against my arms, rubbing warmth into my skin, though nothing could stop the trembling. Every sacrifice I had made over the years lined up in my memory like ghosts. The tuition bills I had covered, the mortgage payment that saved the house, the car repairs, the hospital bills, the countless dinners skipped so I could send money to Mom. And here I was, shivering on wet concrete while they toasted champagne in my honor of being unwanted. Eleanor shifted beside me, her expression tight. She followed my gaze and then spoke quietly. You see how they want you to feel. Small. Ashamed, but they are not as untouchable as they seem. Before I could respond, another burst of laughter erupted inside. I moved closer to the glass door, peering in through the condensation. At the head table, Martin was leaning back in his chair, smug, his arm slung over the back of Mom's seat. She looked radiant in her dress, her pearls catching the light. But her eyes were downcast, as if she could not bear to meet anyone's gaze. I wondered if she thought of me, or if she had convinced herself that I deserved to be out here. Then my eyes landed on James again. For a moment, he looked unsettled. He had stepped away from Lydia to refill his drink, and his glance flicked toward the entrance where I stood. His smile faltered. He looked quickly away, but not before I caught the flicker of nerves. Eleanor noticed it too. She leaned close, her voice dropping even lower. "That man is not as steady as he pretends. He has debts, Greta. Heavy ones. And Martin has tied himself to them." The words sank deep, heavier than the rain soaking my sleeves. I turned to her, searching her face. "How do you know?" She gave a tight smile, eyes never leaving the glowing ballroom. "I make it my job to know." Inside, Lydia had returned to James's side, looping her arm through his as if to claim him. She laughed loudly, tilting her head so her veil shimmered under the chandeliers. The guests around them clapped along with the band, their cheers rising higher, while I stood outside with water dripping from my eyelashes. My chest ached with humiliation, but under it something else stirred. Rage. Not the hot, reckless kind, but the deep and steady anger that comes when you realize people you love have built their joy on your suffering. I pressed the envelope with the will closer to my ribs, the secret truth that gave me strength. The doors swung open again, letting out another rush of warm air and perfume. A pair of bridesmaids staggered out giggling, their dresses brushing the puddles. One glanced at me, her face twisting in amusement, then whispered something to the other. They both laughed harder, disappearing under a shared umbrella. I straightened my spine even as the cold gnawed at me. Let them laugh, I told myself. It would not last. Inside, the band struck up a faster song and the clapping grew louder. I could almost feel the floor shaking under their joy. I stayed rooted on the wet pavement, clutching the envelope, watching the glow of the chandeliers shimmer against the glass, knowing the night was far from over. The rain finally slowed, but the air carried the same icy bite, soaking me to the core. Eleanor and I stood at the edge of the parking lot where the yellow glow from the ballroom spilled faintly onto the wet pavement. The band inside struck up a new song, the rhythm so loud I could almost feel it pulsing through the glass. Eleanor tucked the umbrella under her arm and whispered, "You cannot go in there yet, not like this. Let them believe they have the upper hand." I wanted to believe her, but my body ached with humiliation. My sister's laughter drifted through the doors each time they opened, sharp as broken glass. Every guest brushing past me gave the same look, half pity, half delight at my exclusion. I clenched my fists, forcing my breath to stay even, but inside I was unraveling. Then the doors pushed open again, and Martin himself stepped outside with a cigar already lit. He did not see me at first, but when his gaze landed on me standing there dripping in the shadows, his smile curled into something cruel. "Well, Greta," he said, "you finally learned your place." The words stung worse than the rain. He puffed his cigar, blowing smoke in my direction, and added, "You should be grateful we even let you near the property tonight. Lydia wanted to cut you out completely." I could feel Eleanor stiffen beside me, but I held my ground. My voice shook but did not break. "You have stolen from me." His eyebrows rose, mocking amusement dancing in his eyes. "Stolen? You mean the house?" He chuckled low and taunting. "That place was wasted on you. Your father was a sentimental fool. He should have left it to your mother, to me, someone who knows how to handle real property." Hearing him speak my father's name so casually filled me with rage. I wanted to throw the envelope at his feet, to scream that I had proof, but Eleanor pressed her hand against my arm, a steady warning. "Not yet." Martin leaned closer, lowering his voice, though the smugness never faded. "You always were the weak one. Lydia has beauty, charm, ambition. You have—" He waved the cigar in the air, as if struggling to find a word, nothing but complaints. He blew another puff of smoke, then flicked ash onto the wet ground. My hands trembled, but I refused to step back. I thought of my father, of the will, of the years I had carried this family while being called selfish. For the first time, I did not shrink under Martin's gaze. I met his eyes and let him see the fire behind mine. He scoffed, muttered something under his breath, and turned back toward the ballroom. Just before he disappeared through the doors, he glanced over his shoulder and smirked. "Enjoy the rain, Greta. It suits you." The doors closed, swallowing him in light and music, leaving me with the cold and the smoke curling in the air. I felt Eleanor's hand squeeze my arm gently. "Let him gloat," she said. "He has no idea his time is almost up." I drew a shaky breath, clutching the envelope tighter under my coat. For years I had been their scapegoat, the quiet one, the easy target. But standing there in the wet night, I realized something had shifted. The humiliation was real, the pain sharp, but under it was something steadier, stronger, a resolve I had never allowed myself before. The truth was in my hands, and sooner or later, it would tear their perfect facade apart. The rain had stopped, but the storm was only beginning. The courthouse hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, and my shoes clicked too loudly on the tile as I followed Eleanor toward the hearing room. My stomach twisted even though I had promised myself I would stay steady. Outside the tall windows, the morning light poured in with a sharpness that made every detail stand out. It felt like the world itself was intent on clarity, as if shadows had been chased away to make sure nothing could hide. Eleanor slowed her pace and touched my sleeve. She reminded me to breathe, and I nodded, though my chest felt tight. Inside the hearing room was smaller than I expected, with wood-paneled walls and a row of chairs set against one side. At the front sat a judge who wore glasses low on his nose and studied papers, with deliberate patience. Lydia sat 2 rows ahead with James at her side, her hair polished into a style that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Martin stood near the aisle with a file tucked under his arm, and my mother sat stiffly with her hands folded in her lap. None of them turned when I entered, though I could feel their awareness like static in the air. The bailiff called the case, and Eleanor rose with the confidence of someone who had lived in rooms like this for decades. She introduced herself and placed the certified documents on the table. Her voice carried calm authority, every word measured, as she explained that my father's will had been misfiled, hidden from proper record, and that the property in question had been wrongfully shifted. I watched the judge's eyes move across the lines, his expression unreadable. I could feel Lydia's gaze dart toward me sharp with disdain, and I kept mine fixed forward. Martin stood next, his voice smooth, practiced. He insisted the matter had been settled years ago, that I had relinquished my claim, that any suggestion of forgery was an insult to the family name. His words dripped with certainty, but the more he spoke, the more hollow it sounded to me. I knew the truth of those signatures. I had stared at them long enough to recognize the subtle wrongness, the absence of my own hand. The judge asked questions, his tone neutral, but the pause between each inquiry pressed against the air like weight. Then Eleanor called forward the forensic examiner. A tall man with steady hands laid 2 sets of signatures side by side under the document camera. He explained the pressure points, the inconsistent slant, the way a forged loop can never quite mimic the unconscious ease of the real hand. He pointed to strokes where ink hesitated. He spoke with the precision of someone who let evidence, not emotion, build the story. The judge leaned closer, adjusting his glasses. I saw my mother shift in her seat. For the first time in years, I felt the tide moving in my favor. I felt the rush of vindication pulse through me, but it was tangled with grief. This was not a victory parade. It was a slow peeling away of lies that had held me captive. I remembered my father's steady script on birthday cards, the way he signed notes with care. To see his wishes distorted, bent for greed, filled me with both rage and sorrow. I had to steady my breathing, reminding myself this was not the place to let anger burst. This was about control, about letting truth speak louder than outrage. During a recess, I stepped into the hallway and found my mother waiting by the water fountain. She looked at me with eyes clouded by exhaustion. "Greta," she said softly, "you could end all of this if you just walked away. Think of the family." Her words struck me like a stone. Family, I thought. What kind of family leaves one of their own standing in the freezing rain outside a wedding? What kind of family forges away a daughter's inheritance? Wanted to shout those questions, but instead I said quietly that thinking of the family was exactly why I had to continue. Her lips tightened and she turned away without another word. Back inside, the judge announced that evidence of forgery was sufficient to halt any transfers until a full hearing. It was not final victory, but it was enough to shift the ground beneath us. Lydia's hand clenched around James's arm, and Martin's face flushed a deep red. They had expected to silence me, to crush me with intimidation. Instead, they had been forced into retreat, even if only temporary. I held the envelope of certified copies against my chest and felt its steady weight like armor. When the session ended, Eleanor guided me outside where the courthouse steps glistened under thin sunlight. Reporters lingered nearby, sniffing at the possibility of family scandal. Eleanor advised me to keep walking, and I did, each step lighter than the one before. Still, shadows trailed close. I knew this was far from over. People like Lydia and Martin did not surrender easily. They would scheme, regroup, and strike again when they thought I had lowered my guard. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet. I replayed the day's events, the way Martin's voice had cracked when the examiner spoke, the quick glance of fear that flashed across Lydia's face. For the first time, I sensed that they were not untouchable. The fortress they built was already showing cracks, but even as I felt a surge of hope, a chill ran through me. Hope can be dangerous when it lulls you into thinking the battle is finished. The phone rang, and when I answered, a voice on the other end hesitated before speaking. It was James. His tone carried the strain of someone caught between loyalty and conscience. He said he wanted to meet privately, that he had information I needed to hear. I hesitated, suspicion stirring. Was this another trap? Or was this the twist in the path I had been waiting? For his voice wavered as he said, I can't watch this go on anymore. Meet me tomorrow. My hand tightened around the receiver. I agreed, though my pulse thudded in my ears. That night, sleep came in restless waves. I dreamed of the Walnut Street house, of its creaking steps and warm light. But in the dream, the doors were locked, and Lydia held the keys. I woke with sweat on my skin and a determination that anchored me. Tomorrow would bring another revelation, another test. I whispered into the quiet that I would not bend. Not this time. As I rode the bus home from the courthouse that day, the city felt different, like I was seeing it through a lens wiped clean after years of grime. The trees along Main Street were bare, but their branches reached upward with a kind of defiance that echoed in me. I thought about how many winters they had endured, how many storms had stripped their leaves, and still they waited each spring for renewal. I pressed my forehead against the glass and let the rhythm of the bus steady my thoughts. People talked around me, some laughing, others weary from work. None of them knew the war that had been waged in that courtroom, the legacy that hung in balance, but their ordinary presence grounded me. When I finally reached my stop, I lingered on the sidewalk, staring at the lights of the diner across the street. Families were gathered inside, parents passing ketchup bottles, children swinging their legs beneath red vinyl booths. For a fleeting moment, I longed for that simplicity, the kind of closeness my own family had abandoned. But the ache turned into steel inside me. I knew I could not change the past, but I could change the story that would be told in the future. I walked home slowly, each step deliberate, feeling the resolve settle deeper into my bones. Tomorrow would bring James and whatever secrets he carried, but tonight I let the quiet wash over me. My father's photograph waited on the dresser, his steady eyes reminding me that strength did not always roar. Sometimes it was the simple act of refusing to step aside, of refusing to let lies rewrite the truth. I touched the frame and whispered that I was ready for what came next. James chose the corner table at Riverbend Coffee House where the windows watched the Huron slide past in a slow green braid. I arrived early and counted breaths the way Eleanor taught me. When the bell over the door chimed, James slipped in with his shoulders tucked, as if he were trying to take up less space in the world. He spotted me and stopped a foot short of the table, like he was not sure he had the right to sit. He set a worn folder down and kept his hand on it. The room smelled of espresso and orange cleaner. 2 students quizzed each other softly. Ordinary sounds steadied me. I told him to begin anywhere. He nodded and said the sentence I already knew but needed to hear from his mouth. Lydia told me to keep you outside. It will teach you. It would avoid drama. It would make sure the night stayed hers. Martin called it a necessary boundary. He swallowed hard. He said the guard would do as he was told. He said my mother would never contradict Martin in public. He said he had agreed because he did not know how to disagree anymore. I asked why. He stared at the folder. Money, he said, and shame dragged the word low. He told me his small construction firm had been in trouble for a year. A client defaulted, lumber costs spiked. He patched holes with short-term loans that charged more interest than felt legal. Martin stepped in like a rescuer. Martin offered to introduce him to a private lender. Martin promised the debt could be swept quiet if James kept Lydia happy and let the wedding be what Martin wanted it to be. He said the phrases sounded helpful at first, and then started to sound like instructions from a director no one had hired. He opened the folder. Statements, payment schedules, letters from the lender. He tapped a line with his knuckle. That man at the bar was their representative, he said. Martin guaranteed the note with collateral he claimed was already his to offer. The collateral was the Walnut Street house. He told the lender it was under Lydia's control. He told them your share had been bought out. He told them you would not be a problem. I felt myself go still. I asked if James knew it was forged. He said he believed Martin at first because believing meant he could keep the lights on for 1 more month. He said he started to doubt when the forensic examiner spoke in court and the room went quiet in that particular way where even a cough would feel like breaking a rule. He said he had not been able to breathe right since. There is more, he said, and he slid over a printout of messages. Lydia pushing the wedding up. Lydia writing about optics. Lydia wrote that investors liked a united front. Lydia writes that uncertainty kills momentum. In the middle of the stream sat a single message that read what we might be expecting. No details, no follow-up. He said there had been no appointment, no test, no anything to tie the words to a fact. He said Lydia had needed speed more than truth. I asked why he called me instead of Eleanor. He said he wanted to face me. He said he did not expect forgiveness. He said he did not know if I could even look at him after the rain. I told him I could and that looking was not the same as absolving. I told him I needed a statement in writing, not a confession or record. He said he would write it today, and he would sign in front of a notary if that helped. Eleanor arrived then because I had texted her the address before I left the apartment. She slid into the booth and listened without rescuing him from his own sentences. She asked precise questions, the kind that stay on the side of facts. When James finished, she laid out steps. We would request copies of the loan agreements. We would send notice to the lender that the collateral was disputed. We would schedule time with our attorney for James to deliver his statement properly. If retaliation began, we would ask the court for protection. She said these things the way a nurse explains how to walk after a fall. James asked if I meant to destroy Lydia. The phrasing startled me. I said I was not in charge of ruin, I was in charge of light. If shining it broke something, that would be on the way it was built. He stared at the tabletop, then nodded as if the thought had landed somewhere that mattered. We stepped out into a wind that lifted napkins on the patio tables and sent the river into a pattern of small diamonds. James said he would draft the statement and scan everything else he had. He walked away with his shoulders not as rounded as when he arrived. Eleanor watched him go and said that was as honest as he could be today, and that we would take it. We drove to the address on the business card James had given us. A low brick building with a glass door reflected more sky than anything else. Inside the small lobby, a sleepy brown dog in a bed snored softly. At 4:40, a man in his late 50s stepped into the doorway of a back office and spoke to the receptionist with deliberate hands. The door bore a generic suite name, the kind meant to be forgettable. Eleanor wrote the time the names on the directory, the license plate outside. She did not say we were gathering a map of pressure points, but that is what it felt like. We did not go in. We sat in the car and let the scene set itself in memory. My phone buzzed at 5:20. James had sent 3 scans and a draft of his statement. I read it twice and felt the prickle that comes when someone else finally puts their hand on the same wall you have been pushing against alone. Relief and grief arrived together the way they often do. Eleanor forwarded the files to our attorney with a line that made me feel steady. Here is the shape of the pressure, she wrote. Here is where we push back. On the way home, the sky over Ann Arbor shifted from chalk to a washed blue. Eleanor dropped me at my building and promised she would swing by in the morning. I climbed the stairs and set the folder on the table beside my father's photograph. The heater clicked on with a sound I had loved since I was small. I told myself to let the slow power do its work. My mind kept racing to the picture of the Walnut Street porch, and the pencil marks on the pantry door, and the fact that paper with the right stamps could be as solid as brick. The phone buzzed again. A new number. A photo came first, the courthouse steps from earlier, and then a line of text. You should be careful. No name, no punctuation. The shape of the warning felt familiar. I forwarded it to Eleanor. She called in less than a minute. Lock your door, she said. Leave the hall light on. Keep your phone on loud. I did what she said, and then sat on the sofa with my coat still on and held my breath until the tightness in my chest loosened. After a while, I heated soup and stood at the window with the spoon in my hand. Streetlights came on in a ripple down the block. A child laughed somewhere, a bright sound that cut clean through the evening. A neighbor clinked bottles into a recycling bin. The ordinary world kept ticking. The extraordinary storm of my family's making kept ticking too. Both truths shared the same air. I let them. I took the folder to the dresser and set it beside my father's photograph. I told him out loud what we had learned. I told him that James had chosen to stand on the right side of the line today. I told him we had names and times and copies. I told him we were not rushing and we were not afraid. I pressed my fingers to the glass and felt the cool surface give nothing back, and somehow that steadied me more than comfort would have. Before bed, I wrote a note on a yellow sticky and put it on the mirror. Do not apologize for the truth. I turned off the lamp and lay still and listened to the heater hum. Sleep did not arrive like a tide. It arrived like a firm hand on my shoulder saying enough for now. I let it take me. Morning would bring signatures and stamps. Morning would bring the first official letters. Morning would bring whatever else James had not yet dared to say. I pictured the Walnut Street porch with a fresh coat of paint and a doorbell that worked and a porch light that stayed on. I pictured a house that understood the word safe. I closed my eyes and let the picture hold until I could float on it. I slept. The courthouse lobby smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish, the kind that never really masks the weight of history. I walked in with Eleanor at my side, her folder clutched tight against her chest, while my heels clicked against the marble floor. The building hummed with a quiet urgency, clerks passing from desk to desk, attorneys whispering with their clients. It felt like a machine that had been grinding for decades, swallowing secrets and spitting out judgments. Today, part of that machine was my family. Martin and Lydia were already seated in the gallery, their lawyer leaning close to whisper something into Lydia's ear. She smiled faintly, though her hands clenched around her purse until her knuckles paled. Martin caught my eye across the aisle, his expression smug but taut, like he was trying too hard to wear confidence. I sat on the opposite bench, Eleanor beside me, her hand grazing mine for just a second, enough to remind me I was not alone. When the judge entered, we rose, the rustle of movement filling the room. The first half hour dealt with motions and objections, lawyers circling like wary dogs testing boundaries. I tried to focus on my breathing, counting to 4 on every inhale, holding on the exhale. My palms were damp, my heart a stubborn drumbeat. Then our attorney called James to the stand. James adjusted his tie 3 times before he spoke. His voice trembled at first, but once he started reading from the statement he had drafted, it steadied. He described the loans, the promises Martin made, the threats that followed when payments lagged. He admitted his weakness, his desperation. When he said Lydia had instructed him to keep me outside the wedding, to make sure I learned a lesson, a murmur rippled through the gallery. My chest ached hearing it spoken aloud, but it also lit a fire. No one could erase those words now. Martin's attorney leapt to his feet, objecting, but the judge overruled. James pressed on describing the false documents Martin provided, claiming the Walnut Street house was already under Lydia's control. He even produced copies of the messages Lydia had sent, pushing the wedding up, hinting at a pregnancy that never materialized. My sister shifted in her seat, her face frozen but her jaw tight. I recognized that look from childhood, when she realized a lie was unraveling faster than she could patch it. Eleanor leaned forward, scribbling notes. I watched James's hands, the way they shook when he folded the papers, the way he glanced at me for the briefest second as if asking for some kind of absolution. I gave him a small nod, not of forgiveness but of acknowledgement. He had finally spoken the truth. The courtroom air thickened when Martin took the stand. His suit was sharp, his hair combed back, his posture a soldier's. He spoke with practiced ease, denying forgery, denying coercion, painting himself as the benefactor who only tried to help a struggling son-in-law. His words were smooth, but the edges cut too clean, rehearsed. When he claimed my father had intended the house for Lydia all along, I felt my nails dig crescents into my palm. Eleanor whispered for me to breathe, that overreaching was his weakness, not mine. Then our attorney revealed the forensic examiner's report. The signatures compared side by side glowed on the screen, one genuine, one false. The expert pointed out the tremor in the loop, the unnatural slant, the hesitation marks of someone imitating rather than writing. The silence in the courtroom felt electric. Martin's jaw flexed once, then stilled. Lydia dropped her gaze to her lap. The judge asked a few sharp questions, and Martin's answers began to falter. During recess, I stepped into the hallway, pressing my back against the cool stone wall. My legs shook, not from fear, but from release. Eleanor handed me a bottle of water. "You're holding," she said softly, not just standing. "You're holding the line." I swallowed hard and nodded because she was right. For the first time, I felt like the ground beneath me belonged to me, not to their lies. When the hearing resumed, Martin's lawyer attempted to redirect, painting James as unreliable, desperate, a man willing to say anything to save himself. But then our attorney introduced the bank's own internal emails, obtained through a subpoena. They revealed that Martin had indeed presented documents claiming sole authority over the Walnut Street property. The room shifted again, the weight leaning our way. Lydia's face flushed deep crimson, her lips pressing into a line so thin it almost vanished. As the session drew toward its end, the judge ordered that the disputed property could not be touched until full review. It was a temporary shield, but one that felt like armor. Martin's expression cracked for the first time, a flash of panic before he smoothed it back into arrogance. But I had seen it, and I knew Eleanor had too. Even Lydia noticed, her eyes flicking toward him with something colder than doubt. The crowd dispersed slowly, conversations buzzing, papers shuffled. I lingered, waiting until Martin and Lydia left under the sharp gaze of their attorney. When I finally stepped outside, the evening air was crisp, the sky painted in streaks of orange and lavender. For the first time in years, I inhaled without the weight of their shadows pressing my lungs. Eleanor and I walked to her car in silence, both of us processing, both of us tired but wired. At the stoplight, she turned to me and said, "This is only the beginning. They will strike back. Are you ready?" I stared out at the headlights streaming past, and I realized I was. Fear still lived in me, but it was smaller now, a manageable flame instead of a consuming fire. I nodded. Yes, I'm ready. That night I sat at my small kitchen table, papers spread around me like armor, and began writing a letter to myself. Not for the court, not for evidence, but for me. I wrote about the girl who had stood in the rain, drenched and humiliated, and the woman who now sat steady, no longer begging for a place inside her own family's story. I wrote that the truth had power, that lies crumble when exposed long enough to light. I sealed the letter in an envelope and tucked it beside my father's photograph, a promise not to forget the strength it took to reach this point. The next morning came gray and cool, a drizzle streaking the kitchen window as I sipped coffee that tasted stronger than usual. My body was weary, but my mind refused to rest. I kept replaying Martin's face when the examiner pointed out the forgery, how his lips pressed together as if clenching down on anger, how Lydia shifted in her seat like she wanted to disappear. It was not triumph I felt, but confirmation. The truth had edges sharp enough to cut through years of silence. I thought about calling Eleanor right then just to hear her voice, but I decided to let her sleep. She had carried me far, and now I wanted to carry myself a little too. Later that afternoon, I walked past the Walnut Street house. The shutters sagged a little, the garden overgrown, but the bones of the place stood proud. I imagined repainting the trim, sanding the porch rail, planting marigolds along the walk. A man walking his dog tipped his hat, and I felt for a moment like I belonged there again. It was not just a house. It was a promise my father had left behind, and I would not let it be erased by greed. That evening, the phone rang once more before midnight. An unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Later, listening in the dark, I heard only a low breath and a click. No words. A reminder that shadows linger, that battles are never over in a single day. But I did not tremble. I turned off the phone, pulled the blanket tighter, and let sleep come, heavy but calm, readying me for what came next. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the storm was only just beginning. I drew a long breath, bracing myself as Eleanor gave my arm a squeeze. Inside the ballroom, the music slowed again, the crowd clinking glasses and laughing as if the night was spotless. But I could see the cracks widening. James was pale, his movements stiff, and Martin's booming laugh carried a desperation I had never noticed before. When the microphone passed back to Lydia, she lifted her glass with a triumphant smile. To the family, she said brightly, her eyes flicking toward the doors, as if she could feel me watching. To loyalty, to knowing our place, to the people who stand where they belong. The guests cheered, oblivious to the venom hidden in her words. My chest tightened, but instead of shrinking, I felt the weight of the envelope in my coat and straightened. Eleanor nodded. "This is it, Greta." Before I could lose my nerve, I stepped forward, pulling open the glass doors. The warmth of the ballroom rushed over me, mingling with the smell of champagne and roses. The room went quiet for just a beat, every eye turning toward the wet figure at the entrance. Lydia's smile faltered, then froze back into place, too wide, too polished. Martin pushed back his chair, his voice booming. "Greta, this is not your night. Leave now before you embarrass yourself further." My legs shook, but I walked forward, each step heavier than the last, until I stood near the head table. I pulled the envelope from my coat, water still dripping from its edges. "You want to talk about family," I said, my voice steady though my hands trembled. "Then let's talk about the truth." I laid the papers on the table, the top page facing up where the bold title shone under the light. My father's will. A murmur spread through the crowd, glasses clinking as people leaned closer. Lydia's face drained of color. James stiffened, and Martin's smirk collapsed into something darker. "This house on Walnut Street," I continued, "the one Martin claimed as his own, the one I have been paying for all these years, it was left to me. My father made sure of it, and Martin hid it." Gasps rippled through the room. A cousin I hadn't seen in years whispered to her husband. Guests exchanged looks, their laughter drying up as if the air itself had shifted. Martin's face flushed red. "Those papers mean nothing." He slammed his fist on the table, the glasses rattling. "Old, irrelevant invalid." Eleanor stepped forward, then her voice calm but cutting. "I verified them myself, with the county clerk. The seal is legitimate. If you deny it, Martin, we can take this to court." The room erupted in murmurs, voices overlapping. Lydia's hand gripped James's arm, but he pulled away slightly, sweat beading at his temple. "And there is more," I added, my gaze sweeping across the crowd until it landed on James. "Debts. Business deals. Martin has tied himself to them. Ask your new husband, Lydia. See if he tells you the truth." James paled further, his mouth opening then closing. The man in the dark suit stepped from the back of the room, his presence looming like a shadow. Lydia's eyes darted between them, panic flickering across her face. Mom rose slowly from her seat, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. "Greta, please not here." But it was too late. The facade had already shattered. Guests' whispered phones came out recording snapping pictures. The laughter that had filled the night was gone, replaced by the uneasy buzz of scandal. Lydia's voice broke through, shrill and frantic. "You are jealous! You have always been jealous. Nothing you say changes the fact that this is my wedding." I met her eyes, my voice quiet but clear. "No, Lydia. Tonight is the beginning of the end of your lies." The silence that followed was thicker than the storm outside. Martin glared. James crumbled under the weight of his secrets, and Lydia stood trembling in her gown that no longer sparkled but seemed to suffocate her. I turned then, walking toward the exit with Eleanor at my side, the whispers of the guests following us like a tide. Each step felt lighter, stronger, as if the years of humiliation were finally peeling away. When I reached the doors, I paused, glancing back once. They were still frozen at the head table, their perfect night collapsing around them. And for the first time in years, I felt whole. I stepped out into the night air, crisp and cool, the storm clouds parting to reveal a slice of moonlight. I knew the battle wasn't over. Courts, lawyers, and long fights lay ahead, but I also knew I wasn't alone anymore. I had the truth, I had Eleanor, and I had myself. And maybe that was enough. Now I want to ask you, have you ever been shut out by your own family? Made to feel small so someone else could shine? How did you handle it? And what would you have done if you were standing in my shoes? Tell me in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.